What if everything you thought you knew about slavery was challenged by one man, not through rebellion, not through violence, but through knowledge? Because sometimes the most powerful disruption is simply being who you are. I want you to picture a man walking through London in the 1730s. He's well dressed, he's composed, he's being introduced to important people, merchants, scholars, even members of the elite. But just months earlier, he'd been enslaved in the Americas. His name was Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, and his presence in London created a problem. Not for him, for Britain, because he didn't fit the assumptions people had built their understanding of slavery on. Diallo was born into a respected family in West Africa. He was highly educated, fluent in Arabic and trained in Islamic scholarship. He understood law, religion and literature. He had status, he had knowledge, he had authority. Then he was captured, sold into slavery and transported across the Atlantic. This is where the story usually ends for most people. But for Diallo, it didn't, because even in captivity, he remained exactly who he was, a scholar. And that changed everything. While enslaved in Maryland, Diallo wrote a letter in Arabic. That alone was unusual enough to draw attention. The letter eventually reached people who could read it. And when they did, they realised something that unsettled them. This man they had treated as property was clearly educated, articulate, and intellectually sophisticated. The problem wasn't just that Diallo was exceptional, the problem was what his existence implied. If one enslaved man could be this educated, how many others had been misjudged? Diallo was brought to Britain, freed and introduced into society. He met influential figures. He was observed, discussed and written about. And here's where the tension becomes clear. Britain's involvement in the slave trade relied on a set of assumptions about hierarchy, capability and difference. These assumptions made the system seem acceptable or at least justifiable. Diallo disrupted that, not through protest, not through argument, but simply by existing in a way that contradicted the narrative. He was not what people expected an enslaved person to be. And once that contradiction is visible, it becomes difficult to ignore. Of course, there was an easy way for British society to respond. Treat Diallo as an exception, an unusual case, a rare individual, someone who didn't represent the wider population. That allowed the system to continue without immediate collapse. Because if Diallo is unique, then the assumptions can remain intact. But if he isn't unique, if he is simply one example among many, then the entire justification for slavery starts to weaken. And that question lingers. Diallo didn't lead a campaign, he didn't organise a movement, he didn't write a political manifesto. And yet his impact was real. His story circulated, his presence was recorded, his intellect was recognised. He became part of a growing body of evidence that challenged the moral and intellectual foundations of slavery. Not in a dramatic way, but in a cumulative one. And sometimes that kind of influence is more powerful because it works quietly, steadily, and persistently. What Diallo really did was hold up a mirror. He forced Britain to confront the gap between its self-image and its actions. A society that valued learning, religion and civilisation was participating in a system that denied those very qualities in others. That contradiction didn't disappear overnight, but it became harder to ignore. Let me pause here and ask you something. Do you think individuals like Diallo actually change minds? Or did people just find ways to explain them away? I'd really like to hear what you think, so put them in the comments. Because this question goes right to the heart of how change happens. Diallo eventually returned to Africa. He didn't stay in Britain, he didn't become part of its political system, but his story remained. And over time, stories like his contributed to a broader shift in thinking. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually. They made it harder to maintain simple narratives, harder to justify inequalities, harder to ignore contradiction. This is how moral change often begins, not with one event, but with many small disruptions. So what does Ayuba Suleiman Diallo's story tell us about the making of Britain? It tells us that influence doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it comes from presence, from being seen clearly in a system that depends on misunderstanding. Diallo didn't set out to change Britain, but by challenging its assumptions, he became part of a much larger process, one that would eventually lead to the questioning of slavery itself. And it leaves us with a question that still matters. How many systems depend not on truth, but on what people choose not to see? Thanks for walking a little further along the path that made Britain. If you liked it, there's a button especially for that, and I'd appreciate a click, it really helps. If you subscribe, there's a whole back catalogue of videos like this for you to discover, including this one, chosen especially for you by YouTube. Have a look, I think you'll like it. So until next time, thank you so much, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.